The divisibility rule for 4 says a whole number is divisible by 4 if its last two digits form a number divisible by 4. The divisibility rule for 6 says a whole number is divisible by 6 if it is divisible by both 2 and 3. The divisibility rule for 8 says a whole number is divisible by 8 if its last three digits form a number divisible by 8. The divisibility rule for 10 says a whole number is divisible by 10 if its last digit is 0. The divisibility rule for 11 says a whole number is divisible by 11 if the alternating sum of its digits is divisible by 11. The sign rule says multiplying or dividing two numbers with the same sign gives a positive result. The sign rule says multiplying or dividing two numbers with different signs gives a negative result. The absolute value inequality says a number is always between its negative absolute value and its positive absolute value. The product zero property says if a product is 0, then at least one factor must be 0. The ratio scaling rule says multiplying both parts of a ratio by the same non-zero number does not change the ratio. The proportion property says a proportion stays true if you multiply both sides by the same non-zero number. The cross multiplication rule says a proportion is true exactly when the cross products match. The percent rule says converting between a percent and a decimal uses the fact that percent means per hundred. The unit rate idea says a rate can be compared fairly by converting it to per 1 unit. The scale drawing rule says lengths in a diagram are proportional to real lengths by a fixed scale factor. The graph of a line rule says the solutions of a linear equation form a straight line on the coordinate plane. The slope rule says a line has a constant steepness, meaning its rise-to-run ratio is constant. The midpoint rule says the midpoint divides a segment into two equal lengths. The perpendicular bisector theorem says any point on a perpendicular bisector is equally distant from the segment's endpoints. The converse of the perpendicular bisector theorem says if a point is equally distant from two endpoints, it lies on the perpendicular bisector. The angle bisector theorem, basic, says any point on an angle bisector is equally distant from the two sides of the angle. The converse of the angle bisector theorem says if a point is equally distant from two sides of an angle, it lies on the angle bisector. The perpendicular line theorem says if two lines are both perpendicular to the same line, they are parallel. The parallel line theorem says if two lines are both parallel to the same line, they are parallel to each other. The quadrilateral angle sum theorem says the interior angles of a quadrilateral add to 360 degrees. The polygon angle sum theorem says the interior angles of an n-sided polygon have a fixed total depending only on n. The exterior angle sum theorem says the exterior angles of a polygon add to 360 degrees. The parallelogram opposite sides theorem says opposite sides of a parallelogram are parallel and equal in length. The parallelogram opposite angles theorem says opposite angles of a parallelogram are equal. The parallelogram consecutive angles theorem says adjacent angles of a parallelogram add to 180 degrees. The parallelogram diagonal bisect theorem says the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. The rectangle theorem says a rectangle has all right angles and opposite sides parallel. The rectangle diagonal theorem says the diagonals of a rectangle are equal in length. The rhombus theorem says a rhombus has all sides equal in length and opposite sides parallel. The rhombus diagonal theorem says the diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. The kite theorem says a kite has two pairs of adjacent equal sides. The trapezoid midsegment theorem says the segment joining the midpoints of the legs is parallel to both bases. The circle radius theorem says all radii of the same circle are equal in length. The equal arcs theorem says equal chords cut off equal arcs in the same circle. The converse arc theorem says equal arcs in a circle correspond to equal chords. The tangent chord theorem says the angle between a tangent and a chord equals an inscribed angle subtending the same chord. The cyclic quadrilateral theorem says opposite angles in a cyclic quadrilateral add to 180 degrees. The converse cyclic theorem says if a quadrilateral has opposite angles summing to 180 degrees, it is cyclic. The chord intersection theorem says intersecting chords create equal products of segment lengths. The secant-secant theorem says two secants from the same external point have equal power with respect to the circle. The tangent-secant theorem says a tangent and a secant from the same external point satisfy a fixed power relation. The perpendicular from center theorem says a radius perpendicular to a chord bisects that chord. The converse chord theorem says if a radius bisects a chord, it is perpendicular to that chord. The sum and difference of squares rule says the difference of two squares can be rewritten as a product of a sum and a difference. The square of a sum rule says squaring a sum equals the sum of squares plus twice the product. The square of a difference rule says squaring a difference equals the sum of squares minus twice the product. The factor theorem, basic, says if substituting a number makes a polynomial zero, then the polynomial has a corresponding linear factor. The remainder theorem says the remainder after dividing a polynomial by a linear expression is found by substitution. The angle bisector in triangle theorem says the angle bisector divides the opposite side in the ratio of the adjacent sides. The intercept theorem says parallel lines cut transversal so that corresponding segments are proportional. The probability multiplication rule says for independent events, the probability of both happening equals the product of their probabilities. The conditional probability idea says the probability of A given B measures how likely A is when B is known to happen. The law of large numbers, informal, says relative frequencies tend to settle near the true probability as trials increase. The median property says the median splits an ordered data set into two halves of equal size. The IQR idea says the interquartile range measures spread by focusing on the middle half of the data.